turn to the book of Job. We're going to begin a new series in the book of Job, and I'm calling it Living in the Grace of God. When we look at the book of Job, it is one of the most misunderstood books in the Bible. And I'll be honest, when I first gave my heart to the Lord and was saved, I can remember reading the book of Job. And here's one of the big mistakes that we make with the book of Job. The mistake that we look at a lot of times is the book being about Job. In reality, the book is about God and His faithfulness, His goodness, His character. Now, a lot of times when I preach, I say you want to take notes because some of you are going to need what I'm going to preach about. When we come to the book of Job, everybody needs to take notes. Everybody that is under the sound of my voice this morning, if you live, you're going to endure suffering. Okay? And as we look at the book of Job, the sufferings of Job and sufferings in general is used as one of the biggest excuses for sinners to reject Jesus. Romans tells us, though, that's not true. The biggest reason that people reject Jesus is because of our sin nature, and we like sin. We like our sin better than we do freedom. But suffering is one of the biggest excuses when you're witnessing with a lost person that they use. And what I want to say this morning is suffering is a reality. And we're going to look at chapters 1, 2, and 3 today. And in that, these three chapters present the biggest arguments for their excuses of rejecting Jesus. There's some real, if you don't understand who God is, there's some things in you that can really make you scratch your head. But when you're in the middle of suffering, they can really make you bitter. If you don't know the character of God. Let me explain it this way. My father's a wicked, lost wretch. And yet when he raised me, there's some things he did right. Even though he's a wicked sinner. And those things that he did right, I didn't always understand them nor like them until I had 4 children. Then I could look back and understand why he chose some of those tough things when I couldn't understand it. Okay? When you look at the book of Job, and when you're in the middle of suffering, sometimes you can't understand why God allows some things, why these things are occurring. What you can always do is trust God. All right? Look at verse 1 with me just for a second. It says, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Now it's going to take just a second for me to read you some excerpts out of chapters 1, 2, and 3. But it's important. I didn't put them all on the screen because what the book of Job is doing, it is recorded Job's suffering. And we're able to stand back and look at that. All right? Now here's what's interesting as we dive into the book of Job. The book of Job is the oldest book in the Bible. He was far older. He came way before Moses. Now you say, well, wait a minute, preacher, what about Genesis? Listen, God gave creation, beginning to Moses. But the reality is this. Job lived way before Moses. Y'all follow me? Everybody tracking there? Haven't lost anyone so far? Job lived before Moses. Now Genesis, that's the beginning of time. But Moses wasn't there when it happened. Do you understand what I'm saying? All right. So as we look at the oldest book in the Bible, there's some incredible truths about God's nature, about who God is, and the reality of us living here. And you say, Pastor, what does the oldest book in the Bible have to do with me here in 2018? Friends, listen, man's nature never changes. Evil is as real today as it was 8,000 years ago. You and I are faced with it every day. So I want you to listen to me. That's what I want you to do this morning, is listen. There's some incredibly important truths in here that you're going to need. Verse 2. There was born to him 7 sons, 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the east. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one of his on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them, and he would rise early in the morning, listen, and he'd offer burnt offerings according to the number of them. For Job said, it may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did this continually. Now here's where the rubber meets the road. Here's the part we don't like about this. Verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, from where have you come? And Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down. That's what he's doing today. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on earth, a blameless, upright man who fears God, turns away from evil? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him, his house, and all that he has on every side? You've blessed him. You've blessed the work of his hands. His possessions have increased in the land. And Satan looks at God and says, but you stretch out your hand. You take away those blessings. And you touch all that he has, and he'll curse you to your face. The Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. So Satan went out of the presence of the Lord. Now there was a day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Syrians fell upon them with the edge of the sword, and I alone escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, bam, 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 there came another and said, the fire of God fell from heaven, burned up the sheep servants, consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them, struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you. And while he was yet speaking, there came another, and he said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness, struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Then Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, fell on the ground, and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. And that'd be enough, wouldn't it? We stopped right there. That'd be enough. But the story doesn't stop right there. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. Satan came among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, from where have you come? Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down. Y'all understand the author of evil, right? Y'all pick that up in the story. You won't see that or feel that. It's not as clear when you're in the middle of suffering. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there's none like him on the earth, blameless and upright man, who fears God and turns away evil? He still holds fast his integrity. Although you have sided against him and sided me against him to destroy him without reason. Satan answered the Lord and said, skin for skin. All that a man has, he'll give for his life. But you stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he'll curse you to your face. The Lord said to Satan, behold, he's in your hand, only spare his life. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. He struck Job with the loathsome sores, from sores of his foot, from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a piece of pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in ashes. Then his wife said to him, do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. But he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women who speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? In all that Job did, he did not sin. And I won't refer to it again for a while, but don't be too hard on his wife. She just lost 10 children. Now, when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place. Eliphaz, the Temanite, Bildad, the Shuhite, Zophar, the Naamathite. They made an appointment together to come show him sympathy and comfort. When they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. They raised their voices and wept, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days, 7 nights. No one spoke a word. That's good advice for people who are going through horrific tragedy. Sometimes it's better to listen. For they saw that his suffering was very great. And after this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. Listen to what Job said. Let the day perish on which I was born. The night that said a man is conceived, let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor light shine upon it. It's a pretty incredible story. Suffering, though, is one of those things that when you're going through it, you don't necessarily weigh out its value. You just know that it's real and it's powerful. St. Augustine said this. He said, trust the past to the mercy of God, the present to His love, and the future to His providence. Another great writer said, truth is always strange, stranger than fiction. As you look at verse 1, I want you to notice again, listen to what it says. There was a man. What does that tell us? This is a real story. This really happened. You can't believe in the resurrection of Christ and not believe in the man of Job. He was real. Job was real, just like you and I. Suffering is very, very real. What I like about the book of Job is it is an old message or an old book with a modern message. Here's the problem with suffering. Okay? Now, I want to kind of time out. The major thing that we need to learn out of this is God's nature. You know, there are people in your lives, when you learn their nature, you learn to trust them or avoid them. And the book of Job reveals to us God's unchanging nature. It's not going to answer every single thing you ever wanted to know about suffering, but it's going to give you enough answers that you will never, ever doubt God, nor His goodness. And I'll say it later, but we don't live our lives based on proof. We live our lives based on hope. We live in the most advanced, technologically advanced scientific world that history has ever known. And yet there's greater depths of hopelessness today than there has been ever in history's accounts. We don't survive on proof, hardcore, touchy evidence. We thrive by living through hope, mostly who our hope is in. And here's the problem with suffering, right? Here's the question we all ask is, why do good people suffer? Better yet, why do innocent people suffer? You know, the thing about suffering is, it's an equal opportunity kind of a thing. Rich people suffer, poor people suffer, young people suffer, old people suffer. But here's the answer. Again, every question you've ever had about suffering is not going to be answered here. It's not about you coming and trying to find out why God allowed this or why God did this or why God let this person do this to you. What it's really about is who God is. That's the big thing. The Bible speaks of Job in Ezekiel 14, and we looked at him last week in James 5:11. Here's the thing that Job had experienced in his own life up to this point. Up to this point, Job knew God, and this is what he knew about God, because I want you to think about what we read. I don't know about you, but I don't think I would have responded as positively as Job did. Now, you're in church, so don't lie. I'd been more like the wife. Wouldn't you? I've heard preacher after preacher get up here and jump and stomp and beat and trash her. But I've been with some of you when hard times come. And I've been with me when hard times come. I'd be more like the wife. How did Job have the wherewithal to say some of the things that he did? Here's why. Before tragedy struck in his life, there are a couple things that he had learned about God. Number one, he had known God and God's power. He had witnessed God's wisdom. And he had seen God's justice. He knew that God was all-powerful and all-wise and always good and just. What I want to do is kind of give you an outline of the book. Chapters 1 through 3 is the prologue. It's the introduction into this life story of Job. And then chapters 4 through 41 is the dialogue. We get to see Job interact with God. As Job's walking through his suffering, these tragedies, we will see Job interact with God, and God will speak to Job. How many times in the depths of your suffering have you wanted God to speak to you? And sometimes the toughest part of the suffering is you feel like, where is God? Why isn't He speaking? Why hasn't He answered? Maybe not be the answer you were looking for. Shocked Job. And then the end of the book is the epilogue. It's the conclusion. But man, it is an incredible end to a story. Three statements, three questions that sum up this whole book. It just shows our human nature. It's ones that we all ask when we're suffering. Why me? Why this? And why now? Right? Why me? Why this? And why now? That's on our lips when we're going through suffering. Everyone's, right? Here's some interesting things. Only humans reflect and ponder suffering. You know, animals suffer. But we're the only ones that ponder, which compounds the suffering. Think on it. Why? Because we're created in the image of God. We have this intellectual ability. Here's the truth about suffering. Every tragedy, every piece of suffering that you and I go through, it can either be turned into a weapon for God or against God. That's what's at stake. Our suffering is either a weapon for God or against God. Because you remember, there's more things at play than what we can see here and now. See, that's as much a reality as this podium is this morning. See, it doesn't matter if you believe in heaven or hell. It doesn't matter if you believe in angels. It doesn't matter if you believe in the unseen spiritual world. They believe in you. They're actively at work. Yep. So all of our suffering is either it can be used as a weapon for God or against God. And here's several truths that we need to learn. Suffering doesn't always produce righteousness. I've heard sermon after sermon, the preachers say, listen, they're trying to answer the questions of suffering. What we need to do is stop trying to answer every individual question about suffering and learn more about God. Teach more about God. But I've heard preacher after preacher stand up here and say, listen, suffering, why is it? Well, it's going to drive you to your bottom. It's going to bring you to the bottom and it produces righteousness. Not always. It doesn't always produce righteousness. Sometimes it just speeds you up on the road, the direction you're in. If the direction you're in is for destruction, sometimes it just gives you a little extra horsepower and you become bitter against God. So here we see the scene set. There's this seen world that we live in, and then there's an unseen spiritual world. Here's what I need you to understand this morning. The problem with most Christians is we live as if there is no unseen spiritual world. Now, some Christians take it to the extreme, and we want to participate in that unseen spiritual world. That's not our part. But if you realize there's a whole other unseen spiritual world that's interacting with our seen world, it should draw you closer to God. Amen. And trust Him more. Yep. So number one, let's look at Job, a man at the top of his game. First thing you notice is his affluence, his wealth. All right? And I know you're asking, where in the world, Pastor, is Uz? It says there that Uz is close to Edom. Well, to give you on a map some idea of where Job was, whereabouts, Saudi Arabia. That's where this all takes place. And so that's where Uz, that we're reading about, is today, Saudi Arabia. And so as we look at Job, look at verse 1. There's several statements there. And these statements clarify some things for us. And I think they're some of the most misunderstood statements in all of Christendom. And I'm glad that they're there in verse 1. That's why I just picked out verse 1. And I want you to understand who this man Job is, or was, rather. He is today as we're looking at him. He still is. He's in heaven. And so as you look at these things, you're looking at why do good people suffer? Why do innocent people suffer? Job is the prime example of that. He was innocent. He was a good man. So how do you know, Pastor? God Himself gives this description of Job. And let me explain to you what it means there as we look at it, because he says several things. He says he was perfect and upright. Now, that doesn't mean that Job was sinless. What it does mean is that he had a complete and mature character. Job was complete and mature and straight in his conduct. That word perfect, it's relating to his integrity. Well, Pastor, what does all that mean? People with integrity are whole people without hypocrisy. Okay? And what does it mean to be whole? Well, here's what it means. It means that he was saved. It means that he had Jesus in his heart. He was a believer. See, if you don't have Jesus in your heart, you're not whole. You're missing a piece. And God's describing His relationship with Job, and He's describing Job's character and the way Job lived. The rich young ruler is a perfect example. The rich young ruler, if we were to compare Job with the rich young ruler had everything. He could match Job, except he wasn't whole. He came up to Jesus and he said, Jesus, what must I do to be saved? Job was whole. There it says he was blameless. That's relating to his character. That's who he was. Okay, he was whole, and he had integrity because of his relationship with God. And then his conduct, that's what he does. So he was saved. He turned to God. He was sanctified. He turned away from evil. He turned away from the world. Notice God's own testimony about him there in verse 8. And the Lord said to Satan, have you not considered my servant Job? That there's none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away. Here's some incredible things about Job that you and I need to look at and look at our own lives. What do we see about the man Job? We see that he was spiritually sensitive. That's what God said about him. That's who he was. He was a praying man. He was a priestly man. What do you mean? He was the priest of his household. Men, look up here. If you are married, you are the priest of your household. It's not up for discussion. It's not up for debate. The only thing that you need to figure out is how good a job are you doing. So we see that he was a priestly man. He prayed for his children. He was a man of faith. He was a great man of God. Now, here's the other thing we learn about suffering. Our behavior doesn't always cause suffering. What do you mean, Pastor? Well, what I know is most often when people go through suffering, sometimes it's obvious that we brought suffering on ourselves. Sometimes it's just obvious. But the thing we learn from Job is suffering is not always cause and effect. We don't always cause directly our suffering. You don't believe me? Wait till we get into his friends. We looked at his friends there in chapter 3 or chapter 2. They described a little bit about coming. For 7 days they were great friends. And then for several weeks they were horrible friends. All they did is talk to Job and say, well, Job, what'd you do to cause this suffering? And what we learn is suffering is not always a result of our own behavior. There's not always a cause and effect that we're responsible for. The Bible also tells us about Job, gives us some foundation of his character. It says he feared God and he shunned evil. One of the most misunderstood things that I find in the church is a fear of God. Well, what does it mean to fear God? It's not talking about how a slave relates to their master. It refers how a child relates to a father. Child who fears their father or respects their father, they relate to their father with respect. Job had that kind of relationship. He said he feared God. He lived a life of respect, showing that he loved the Lord, that his relationship to the Lord was important to him, that he was close to the Lord. And then we see his family. You know, but Psalms tells us, behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, and the fruit of the womb a reward. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them, and he shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate. You see, what we're seeing here is he had 10 children. What that says, what they believed in his time and day was, when your quiver was full, it was a sign that God himself had reached down from heaven and blessed you. And so we're seeing all these things. See, what I need you to understand is God gave us the book of Job so that we could cut through some of misinformation. What I've noticed about even believers is we're more superstitious sometimes than we are biblically minded. I know that after I started reading the book of Job, the first time through after I got saved, I had some things come to me, some bad things. And for a long time I thought, boy, that's my first and last time reading that book, brother. And I've heard other people refer to it like that. And so what we're going to see in the book of Job is, listen. Life doesn't work that way. I mean, we've seen all these old wives' tales and all these things, you know, troubles come in threes, death come in threes. And then you're beginning to look at Job and you're like, one, lost his kids. No. It really doesn't work that way. The best thing you can do is throw your old wives' fables out and learn about the nature of God. Amen. And you can cut through some of this. Sometimes because we don't understand the spiritual side that relates to the physical side in which we live in, we just try to give the benefit of the doubt and make up some things. The truth is so much more comforting than superstition. And so we see that from outward appearance, though, in every way, when you look at Job, you see a righteous man. You see a man that is blessed by God. He has wealth. He has children. Everything seems to be going his way. You see there that he has, in verses 4 and 5, a great relationship with his children. You see that Job had an incredible spiritual concern for his kids. Did you see that? That he gets up and he makes offerings for his children in case somehow they've offended God. Somehow they've turned away from God. When you look at his assets, here's what the Bible... You ever wonder, well, why did he list all of his assets, preacher? Well, there's several reasons. As you look at his assets and all that is around him, the Bible is basically telling us this. He had everything in life that you could ever want. Job had it. He had faith, family, fortunes. He had future. In the Hebrew, it's amazing how the original language gives us a better picture. The Hebrew actually hints at and tells us that he had incredible health and he was a good-looking, aesthetically pleasing man. So he had everything in life that one could want, Job had. Here's the thing that's most important. The greatest asset that Job had was his perception of himself. Now this is important. You don't want to miss this. You men, look at me. You men, we most often miss this. It doesn't matter. I've seen men who they're mean and macho, and they're as stupid as it comes when it comes to this truth. But Job didn't miss this. Okay? Job had a correct assessment of who he was. And here it is. He had not allowed his assets to dim his spiritual sight. It's important. He didn't measure eternity in dollars and cents. Y'all hear that? He didn't measure eternity in dollars and cents. Do you understand how difficult that is? Job had everything that a human could want. Yet that's not what he measured as important. You see, among the Jews, their thinking was, he was great, because they thought if you were a great man of God, God would financially bless you. And it's kind of a, if you will, a kick at that. The book of Job lists that, and it says, wait a minute, Job was a righteous man. One minute he had everything, and he was a righteous man. The next minute he had nothing, and he was still a righteous man. See, I learned when I began to go out of the country, we right now are praying about a foreign mission here, because here's the thing. You see me get up here and stomp and holler and run back and forth and tell you that we're missing it. We're missing the point of Christianity. All America has missed the point of Christianity. We think as long as we're happy, wealthy, and wise, that God is pleased with us. And the problem with that is the other 9/10 of the world is under the poverty level, buried under the poverty level, and I think they're one up on us on the blessed and the godliness factor. When you leave this country, you'll see that the majority of Christians are poorer than church mice, and they're living every day, not valuing the future like dollars and cents either. And that's what the Bible is pointing out to us, is all his culture thought because he was such a wealthy man that he was God's man. But the Bible tells us, listen, he had everything that a man could want for, and he was righteous. And in the next breath, he had nothing to his name. But he was still righteous. We see that his wealth, his possessions, his children, and then finally his health were taken. But it says he was still righteous. You see, here's how the plum rolls, okay? When everything's going our way and everything is good and finances and health, we love God, don't we? But when she all turns upside down, do we still love God? Maybe a better question is, the one we ask most often is, does God still love us? And the answer is always yes. See, that's what the Bible's pointing out, is you're looking, Job's an incredible book. It shows us from man's perspective, then it shows us from God's perspective. From man's perspective, we still can be blessed by God and be in God's favor and don't have two red nickels to rub together. But from God's perspective is that we may not have two red nickels to rub together, and God still loves us as much as he would if we had everything the world says is important. Even when we're going through suffering, God still loves us. So as you look at the Bible, it's incredible, this story of Job. See, Job, by all accounts, was the perfect man. He didn't have any sin in his life. He wasn't, cheating on his wife, his taxes, or any of those things. And so he's the perfect test, if you will, of God's love, of God's worth, if you will. See, that's the real issue here. The real question of the book of Job is God really, is he really a good God? Can you really trust him? When it's sunshine and everything is going our way, that's not the greatest time for a test of God's faithfulness. But when your health fails, your finances fail, tragedy strikes, that's when you find out if he's really as good as he says he is. We look into this unseen world. In the book of Job, you're going from the visible to the invisible. From the visible to the invisible. You and I have to understand that when we're going through suffering, there's always an invisible part. There's things going on. When we don't see God move, it doesn't mean He's not moving. It just means we can't see it. Notice, if you will, verse 1 and verse 6, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless, upright, and one who feared God, turned away from evil. Verse 6, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. Satan also came among them. Do you notice the difference here? Think about this scene unfolding. Job's there lying on his bed. All is perfect. And then all turns upside down. You know what we are to learn from that? In the deepest points of our suffering, our emotion tells us that God's no longer in control, that Satan's the captain of the ship. What we learn from the truth is, see, God in the book of Job, I love it because, you have all kinds of preachers that come and they tell you, and they teach all these things on spiritual things, and they tell you about this unseen world. Where they get their information, I don't know. But the book of Job peels back the unseen world, tells us what's going on. And in the book of Job, what we see is when you and I are in the midst, in the deepest part of our sufferings, we can't see or can't seem to hear from God. And it seems like Satan's the guy calling the shots. It's not the truth. It's not the truth. There's never a time when God is not in control. See, Job teaches us just the opposite of what our emotions tell us. Here's the other thing that Job teaches us. We want to strike at the hand that feeds us. It's just human nature. But here's the thing that you have to understand about what's really going on. Though we feel like God's silent, we feel like God's not doing anything, He is. He's working. But the other thing you have to understand is we're building here. Okay? There's just not one statement that's going to tell you how to understand this and process suffering. One thing you need to learn is that Satan will use every tool in his toolbox to destroy you and discredit God. Satan will use every tool in his toolbox to destroy you and discredit God's goodness. That's the truth. That's reality. Notice the sequence, if you will, there in verse 11 and his strategy. Verses 7 there, Satan is looking for what? Flaws in Job. Not really. Satan's trying to use Job to point out to us flaws in God's character. That's the real underlying thing. Remember, we see man's perspective and we get to see the spiritual perspective. Job is saying, look, there's Job. Let me at him. I'll show you that he doesn't love you. But really what he's trying to say is, I'm going to use Job as a weapon to make people see God's flaws. From the very beginning that we have any record of Satan in the Garden of Eden, what is he doing? He's telling Adam and Eve that God's not good. That He doesn't have the best intentions for us. And He's always looking for ammunition. Do you know what I mean by ammunition? Remember, our suffering, it either produces weapons for God or against God. We're the weapons. We're the weapons. Verse 8, he's questioning God's integrity. As if you will, there in verse 11, listen to what he says in verse 11. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, he'll curse you to your face. Chapter 2, listen to what he does in verse 5. But stretch out your hand, touch his bone and his flesh, and he'll curse you to your face. See, the devil is always interjecting doubt about God's character, about God's authority, and about God's wisdom. Satan is always saying, can you really trust God? If God was good, why did He allow this? And then as you progress down this road of suffering, you'll say, well, okay, maybe He is good and He's just not big enough to do anything about your suffering. That's the way He works. So we look into this spiritual realm. You say, wait a minute, what in the world is Satan doing in heaven? Well, when you go to Revelation chapter 12, the first thing that you learn that there's several different spheres. The first heaven, the atmosphere in which we breathe. The second heaven, space. And then the heaven where God resides is beyond that. But what I want you to notice is, what is Satan constantly doing? We call him the accuser, right? Because he's the accuser of the brethren. But he has to have some access to God in order to carry out that function. Make no mistake, that is exactly what he is doing. That's exactly what he is moving toward and what he's always doing. Secondly, look at Job's trouble as it adds up. You see the devil's daily routine. The devil's daily routine, Peter tells us in 1 Peter 5:8, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. He's constantly walking around accusing. Here's what he accused Job of. But more importantly, listen to what he accused God of. He accused God of paying Job to worship him. Did you get that? When the devil, remember, it's twofold. He says, listen, God, if you take away his wealth, he'll curse you. God, if you take away his good looks, he'll hate you forever. He's standing there, not just accusing us, but he's accusing God. He's saying, God, the only reason that man, if you'll take away his wealth, I promise you, I wager you, that he'll curse you. He's accusing God of bribing us to worship him. Do you know what that really is a strike at? It's a strike to our faith. Let me remind you, you say, well, Pastor, I'm going through suffering and you can't imagine, and you're probably right. What do I do? How do I build up my faith? I've heard so many people talk about growing your faith, building up your faith. Listen, Romans 12:3. You've got all the faith when you were born you were ever going to have. It's not about how much faith you have. It's about where you place that faith. You see, that's what Satan is. He's making a charge at our faith, at our belief in God. Here's my advice when you're going through suffering. Remember, facts. We don't live by facts alone. If we did, we'd have the greatest culture on the face of the earth. But I dare say that the culture in which we live in is one of the worst in history. We live by hope. The question is, whose hope? Where is your hope right now? Where have you placed your hope? And here's the thing that we need to learn from this. This is what suffering will really teach you. Are you worshiping God for what He gives you or for who He is? There's no way around it. Suffering strips back all the layers of hypocrisy. Remember, when the sun's shining, it's easy to worship God. When the storm rolls in, and you have no control of the situation, that's when you really learn. And I want you to learn something about Satan. We have all these pictures of Satan in this red suit, this pointed tail, and all that. Satan is a created being. He's not like God. He's not omnipotent and all that. But he should be a respected foe. I see so many, I don't have a better word other than stupid Christians. If you taught your children that's a bad word, I apologize. But I see so many stupid Christians walking around like they're going to take on Satan, like they're going to do this to Satan. You might want to get out there and play chicken with a Mack truck. Do you see what you learn about Satan? You say, well, wait a minute. God has the victory. You know, when you got a bull on the fence and you own it, you've got control of it. But you know what I learned growing up on a farm? A bull's only in the fence as long as he wants to be in the fence. When he decides to come out of the fence, you know what the bull does? No matter what your fence looks like, the old bull comes out of the fence. What you learn about Satan is this. He has intellect. He talks with God. He has emotions. You see how antagonistic he is? He has emotions and he has volition. You see the premeditation he has on the part of Job? He's been thinking about this. He's been roaming, looking, and he's been saying, oh, there's one. There's Job. That's the guy I'm going to use to get back at God. What's the lesson, Pastor? Don't smack the bull. He is a dangerous foe. And you're not God. We have victory because of the cross. Just don't smack the bull. That's right. But look what verse 7, or verse 12 rather says. It's interesting. It says, and the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. Probably the hardest part about suffering for me, I mean, it's undeniable. We want to ask the question, how could God be good? Who gave the go-ahead for the trial? God. You say, Pastor, why is that? Why is that? Why did God give the go-ahead? Listen, I know what time it is, but if you'll give me about 10 minutes, I'm going to wrap this up. This will be truth that you can live with in victory in your life from here on out. See, the hardest part about suffering, I believe, sometimes that God gives the go-ahead, and then God's seeming silence as it happens. I mean, imagine there's Job. He's laying in bed, all is right, and the phone starts ringing. It says 500 oxen, gone. 500 donkeys, gone. 300 camels stolen. 7,000 sheep killed. 10 children killed. One day, Job went from top to bottom. One day. I know, I kind of got a sense of what that was and how that is. And I remember when Sherry was in labor with Austin, over 24 hours of labor, and I mean, we had all kinds of complications and lots of trouble. You talking about a man that come to appreciate the book of Job, is I was out in the hall praying that God would have his hand on my son, and here comes out literally in the hands of a nurse, a dead baby. But it wasn't mine. But room, when was I? You say, well, why wasn't it yours? I don't have any other reason to tell you that in an instant we could go from top to bottom. In an instant. That's why Ecclesiastes tells us that no man knows his time. See, the easy Bible answer. Here's the easy Bible answer. See, the problem with a lot of churches is we have all these wannabe theologians. And they'll take this part of the Bible and they'll cut out 2/3 of the Bible. The problem with that is, it'd be like taking one of your tires off and trying to go down the road. How well does that work for you? See, the easy answer is God's sovereign. Pastor, you don't believe God's sovereign? I do. But when you're hurting, you want a little bit more of, what's that look like, Pastor? How about, where does my heart fit into God's sovereignty? So the great thing is God does want us to have a little bit of that knowledge, or else He wouldn't have written all the Bible for us. Do I believe it's God's sovereignty? I do. Why? Because 31 times, see, all you see in your translation is G-O-D, God. But that's not what they were calling Him. They weren't saying, Job wasn't saying God. G-O-D, translated into Hebrew 31 times here, is literally the Almighty. See, really, they wasn't saying God, they were saying the Almighty, the Almighty, the Almighty. See, the truth of the matter is, no matter what you're going through, He is the Almighty. But how does that translate to where I live? That's the questions we all have in our hearts, right? Here's the truth. And I got up this morning and God gave me some extra. I know you may not like extra before lunch, but you'll like it in suffering, kids. Nothing can come to us. Nothing can come to us except through God. That sounds great on this side of suffering. over there in the pit of suffering, it's not to encourage. But here's what I'm learning. You say, well, how then could a good God, why would He even allow evil to come to us? Here's some truths. It's not going to answer every question or not every eye that you've got. But here's some truths I learned even this morning. God gave to me right out of the Word of God. Listen. The reality is this. The evil that you and I see today, we live with, that produces suffering, it was not God's original intent. Genesis 1 and 2. Remember, you theologians, you can't do away with chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis. So, well, wait a minute, God's sovereign. He is sovereign. But His original intent was for us to live lives that were not attached nor involved in all this evil that you and I suffer from. That's His original intent. If your theology doesn't include His original intent, you've got some bad theology. It wasn't God's intent for us to live in this world with evil. See, that's why even when a 90-year-old person has lived a full life, even when they die a peaceful death, isn't there still right here in our heart this place that wells up and you go, it just wasn't just. Right? Death, regardless, whether it's a baby, whether it's a 90-year-old person, there's just some sense of wrongness about it, isn't it? It's because it wasn't God's intent in any form. See, our greatest struggle is that all of our life we've been taught that we are the center of the universe. And my husband or your spouse is supposed to live their lives making you feel satisfied and fulfilled. Or that children are going to bring satisfaction and fulfillment to you. Or that a job, a career, or money, or sex, or some kind of outside influence that's going to come to you and you're the center of your world is going to somehow satisfy you. The problem with that thinking is that we're really not the center of the universe, are we? God is the center. And when bad stuff happens to us and we realize that we're not the center of the universe, the first thing we want to ask is, why did God allow that evil? Here's the most biblical and the greatest answer that I learned even this morning. How could a good God even allow evil to come to us? Remember, it wasn't His intent. But why would He even allow it then? Because eventually it'll bring us even suffering will bring us the greatest joy. You say, preacher, how could my suffering, how could evil ever be used to bring me greater joy? Here's where you have to trust God. And you say, well, how can I trust Him? Because He stepped out first and applied this truth to Himself. You see, without the evil, and the suffering, and the murder of Jesus, His own Son, His innocent own Son, we would never have known the depths of love God has for us that He had at the cross. And the reality is this morning, there's a whole lot more truth here. And I don't know where you are. I don't know what suffering you're going through. And I don't know what suffering you or I will go through tomorrow. What I do know is that because of the cross, there's never a time when God's not good. And there's never a time when evil has to be permanently king. Most importantly, there's never a time when God didn't mind. See, without the cross, none of it makes sense. But it's through the cross that God brings ultimate healing. Would you bow your heads this morning?